A grieving mother returns to the grave she never thought she'd see again, only to find a pregnant stranger weeping at her son's name. What begins as confusion quickly turns into something neither of them expected. The boots stopped at the edge of the stone like they had 100 times before, polished leather, laces drawn tight, no dirt on the heels. Her coat fluttered faintly in the breeze, not from the cold, but the nerves she'd trained herself never to show. Josephine Vale didn't cry at graves anymore. She hadn't for years. She'd built walls too high, worn pearls too tight, and climbed into beds too clean to remember what it was like to kneel. But the moment her eyes settled on the figure hunched beneath the twisted cedar tree, something cracked in her chest like dry bark underfoot. A girl knelt there, young, no older than 20, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. Her dress was dusty, hem torn and clinging to her knees like it had traveled too far without rest. And her belly, rounded and full beneath the thin cotton, rose and fell with each broken breath. Josephine's voice was not accustomed to trembling. "Excuse me." The girl startled, nearly toppling over, her hands flying to her stomach as if to shield the child from something unseen. Her eyes met Josephine's, wide and wild, and for a moment neither woman said a word. Then, slowly, the girl looked back to the grave. Elias Vale. Beloved son, a heart too big for this world. Josephine's breath caught. She hadn't brought flowers this time. She rarely did. But now she wished she had, something to hold, something to offer, anything at all to fill the strange, tight silence. The girl spoke first, her voice thin and cracked. "I didn't know anyone else came here." Josephine took a slow step forward. "I could say the same." The girl blinked, confusion flickering across her face, and then something else, a kind of dawning horror. "You are you." Josephine didn't nod. She didn't have to. "I'm his mother." The girl gasped softly, one hand covering her mouth. "Oh God." There it was again, that hollow, breathless ache. Josephine stepped beside the girl and lowered herself, careful not to brush the gravestone. The ground was dry, the cedar's roots curled up like bones beneath the soil. The girl was crying again, silently now. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to." "What's your name?" Josephine asked, not unkindly. "Clara," she whispered. Josephine let the name settle. "How did you know my son?" Clara didn't answer right away. She shifted, brushing the back of her hand beneath her nose, and looked down at the grave again as if hoping it might speak for her. "I met him in Salder's Crossing," she said finally. "I worked at the inn there. He was staying the night on his way back from the border." Josephine's mouth set in a thin line. Elias had never told her that. Then again, there were many things her son had kept from her. She thought herself prepared for that, but she hadn't expected this. "I didn't know who he was," Clara said quickly. "Not until later. I swear I didn't mean." "Did he love you?" Josephine asked, her voice softer than expected. Clara blinked, stunned by the question. Then she nodded slowly. "I think he did, for the short time we had." Josephine looked away. Her hands, folded neatly in her lap, were trembling. "I didn't come for money," Clara added quickly, voice catching. "I didn't even know where to go. I just wanted him to know about the baby." Josephine swallowed hard, her throat dry as sand. "He doesn't," she said simply. And then she stood, the sudden movement pulling a quiet gasp from Clara. But Josephine didn't look angry. If anything, she looked like she was trying not to fall apart. "Come with me," she said. "What?" "You're not sleeping out here tonight." Clara hesitated, arms wrapped tightly around her stomach. "I didn't ask," Josephine said, already turning. "The carriage is just beyond the hill." Clara rose slowly, knees aching, dress still clinging. She didn't understand what this was. Mercy, pity, guilt, maybe all of it. They rode in silence. The driver said nothing, eyes trained ahead. Josephine stared out the window as if trying to piece together a world that had shifted beneath her feet. Clara sat with both hands pressed to her belly, as if afraid the baby could hear her thoughts. The Vale estate rose like a forgotten crown above the hills, stone walls, tall windows, everything wrapped in shadowed ivy and grief. Clara stared as they approached, her breath catching in her throat. "You live here." "I survive here," Josephine said. Inside, the house felt too large. Footsteps echoed where laughter once lived. A maid appeared, startled, but Josephine waved her off. "She'll stay in the east wing." "For how long, ma'am?" Josephine didn't answer. She was already walking away. Clara stood alone for a long moment, then followed the maid without question. Her room smelled of lavender and linen. The sheets were turned down. There was a pitcher of water by the window, still cool. She didn't sleep that night. Neither did Josephine. Sometime near dawn, Josephine wandered to Elias' room. Nothing had changed. His books still lined the shelves. His boots were tucked neatly beneath the window seat. The dust lay like a burial shroud. She sat on the edge of the bed and closed her eyes. But instead of peace, she saw Clara, kneeling at his grave, belly full with a child he never knew. And for the first time in years, she whispered his name like a prayer. Morning came not with sunlight but with the steady tick of the grandfather clock in the front hall. Josephine Vale sat in the drawing room, a teacup cooling in her hand, though she hadn't taken a sip. Across from her, the fire flickered behind its grate, casting long shadows that curled up the walls like questions left unanswered. Her gown, a soft gray she hadn't worn in years, hung loose on her frame. Too many things had become loose in this house: buttons, hinges, hearts. The knock at the parlor door was soft, hesitant. Then came the voice, almost apologetic. "Ma'am, she's awake now." Josephine nodded once. The maid disappeared. Upstairs, Clara had dressed slowly, unsure whether to touch anything. The embroidered quilt, the carved vanity, the framed sketches on the wall, everything here felt too delicate, like stepping wrong might make it all collapse. She stood near the window now, holding her stomach, watching the wind play in the orchard below. When the maid returned, she followed without a word. Josephine didn't rise when Clara entered. She only gestured to the seat across from her. "Sit. You should eat something." Clara hesitated, then obeyed. Toast and soft eggs waited on a silver tray, untouched. She reached for them slowly, her fingers trembling. Josephine watched her with the studied silence of someone used to commanding rooms without ever raising her voice. "How far along are you?" 7 months, Clara said quietly. "And no family?" Clara shook her head. "My mother died when I was a girl. I don't know my father. It was just me at the inn, until Elias." The name fell between them like a dropped plate, too familiar, too fragile. Josephine flinched, almost imperceptibly. "I didn't expect this," Clara said after a moment. "Not any of it. I came because I thought he deserved to know. I wasn't asking for anything. But now you're here." "I'll leave if you want me to," Clara added quickly. "I don't want to make things worse." Josephine stood abruptly. Her hands were tight fists at her sides. "My son rode to the border to negotiate a land deed. He was supposed to be gone 4 days. On the 5th, they sent a telegram, ambushed on the way back. No survivors." Clara's mouth parted. "I didn't know." "Of course you didn't." Josephine's voice cracked just slightly, then steadied again. "Because I didn't know either. About you, about the child, about who he was when he was away from here." Clara said nothing. There was nothing she could say. Josephine turned back to the fire. "I wasn't a good mother," she said after a moment. "I was ambitious. For him, I thought, but maybe for myself. I married well, raised him right, gave him everything a boy could want, except space, except freedom. He left more and more as he got older, wrote less, smiled less. By the end, he barely came home." Clara swallowed hard. "He was kind to me." Josephine's eyes met hers then. "Then you knew a part of him I never did." Silence fell again, thick and loaded. The clock chimed the hour. Somewhere down the hall, glass rattled faintly in a window frame. Josephine exhaled. "You'll stay for now. The child is his, that makes you," she hesitated, then finished, "family." Clara blinked. "Are you sure?" "No," Josephine said, "but that's not the point." The days that followed unfolded like a fragile treaty. Clara stayed mostly to the east wing. She walked in the orchard in the afternoons, careful with her steps, one hand always at her belly. Josephine resumed her routines with only minor disruptions: letters written, charity meetings skipped, tea taken alone. They passed each other in the halls like ghosts in the same dream. But the house had changed. Once silent and cold, now it echoed faintly with footfalls not her own. The cook began baking more. The maid set out softer blankets. There were new sounds, low hums, Clara speaking to the child she hadn't met yet, sometimes laughter, though soft and uncertain. And each time Josephine heard it, something in her chest twisted. On the fifth day, Clara found a box outside her door. Inside, a pair of small knitted boots, hand-stitched, never worn. There was no note. She cried for nearly an hour, alone in her room, clutching them to her chest. By the second week, a rhythm had formed. Josephine had her morning tea, Clara had her walks. They sometimes sat in the garden together, not speaking. Occasionally, Josephine would ask a question, how Clara was feeling, if she wanted a different pillow, if the baby kicked often, and Clara would answer, short but honest. They did not pretend affection. They didn't need to. What they shared now was stranger than friendship and deeper than duty. It was grief tangled with possibility. One afternoon, while Clara sat beneath the arbor, Josephine approached with a bundle of linens in her arms. "These were Elias's," she said simply. "His christening gown, his first quilt. I kept them." Clara took them as if they were holy. "I want the child to have them," Josephine said, voice tight, "even if he never knows me." Clara looked up. "You can know him." Josephine didn't answer. Her eyes were too full. But peace, even brittle peace, never lasts. It began with a letter, delivered by hand. The messenger wore the uniform of the Southern Railway, a sharp coat, brass buttons. He tipped his hat, said nothing, and left. Josephine opened the letter in the drawing room. Her face drained of color as she read. She didn't call Clara right away. She waited until sunset, until the light had turned soft and gold across the orchard, until the fire in the grate had died to embers. Then she went to the east wing. Clara was sewing by the window. Her belly had grown in the last weeks, a round shape rising beneath her dress. She looked up as Josephine entered. "There's a man coming," Josephine said, "from Elias' regiment." Clara's hands froze. "Why?" "He claims to have been with him on the border, says he survived the ambush, and that he's owed something." Clara's breath caught. "What kind of something?" Josephine's gaze hardened. "That's what I intend to find out." The man arrived 2 days later. His name was Caleb Rourke, lean and sharp-eyed, the kind of man who looked like he could smell lies better than truth. He wore a scar across his temple and a grin that never reached his eyes. Josephine greeted him in the front hall. Clara stayed upstairs, watching through the banister rails like a child. "Mrs. Vale," Caleb said, tipping his hat, "you look just like he described." "You knew my son." "We served together," Caleb said, "fought together, bled together. And now I come with what he left behind." Josephine stiffened. "And what's that?" Caleb's smile widened. "Me." Josephine didn't blink, didn't speak. Caleb Rourke stood confidently in the center of her front hall, mud still drying on his boots, his hat clutched loosely in one calloused hand like he belonged nowhere and everywhere at once. He had the kind of smirk that wasn't shaped by amusement. It was carved from something harder, something that had learned how to survive by staying unpredictable. "Explain," Josephine said finally, her voice flat. Caleb spread his arms slightly, not in surrender but in invitation. "He saved my life, twice. Second time cost him his. We were pinned on the trail, ambushed by a band of deserters pretending to be riders from the crossing. Elias saw through it too late. Josephine's fingers twitched at her sides. The telegram said no survivors. Wouldn't be the first time the wires got it wrong, Caleb said. I stayed behind, hidden in the bluffs till they cleared out, buried what was left of him with my own hands. Josephine's jaw tightened, but she said nothing. Her silence, sharpened by grief and suspicion, did more than words ever could. Caleb took a step closer. I made him a promise. If anything happened, I'd come here, make sure his people knew the truth. Josephine stared at him, unflinching. And what truth is that? Caleb's grin softened, almost into something human. That he wasn't running from anything, that he was trying to come home. Behind the stairwell, Clara felt her knees buckle slightly. She gripped the railing tighter, heart hammering. She hadn't known what to expect from this man, but it wasn't that. Not tenderness, not devotion, not loyalty spoken like a vow. Josephine drew in a slow breath. Why now? Months have passed. Caleb tilted his head. Took me a while to crawl back, and longer to get the guts to knock on this door. He didn't wait for permission. He reached into his coat and drew out a leather-bound journal, the spine cracked and faded. Thought you'd want it. Josephine didn't move. It wasn't until he gently placed it on the table beside her that she dared to glance down. Elias' handwriting was burned into the cover. She knew it instantly. Every part of her trembled, but her face didn't change. I'll have a room made up for you, she said. You'll stay here until I decide what to do with you. Caleb chuckled softly, not mockingly, just tired. Fair enough. That night Josephine didn't sleep. She sat in her room, the curtains drawn tight, Elias' journal resting on her lap. The house was quiet, save for the ticking of the long case clock down the hall. Her fingers hovered over the pages for a long time before she finally opened it. The first entries were dull, lists of towns, travel notes, broken thoughts half finished. But then they deepened. Mentions of Clara. Of her laugh, the way she added honey to her tea, the way she paused before answering questions like she was afraid her truth would be too much. One line caught her. I never told Ma about Clara. I don't think I know how to. She'd turn her into a project. But Clara's not meant for polishing. She's meant for quiet places and people who speak gently. Josephine's eyes blurred. She closed the book. In the morning, Caleb stood at the edge of the orchard, one boot propped against the split-rail fence. Clara approached him slowly, her hands resting on her belly, her steps cautious but sure. You're the one who was with him, she said softly. Caleb turned. He didn't smile this time, he just nodded. You must be Clara. I didn't think he told anyone about me. He didn't need to. The way he talked, I knew there was someone he wanted to get back to. They stood in silence for a moment. Then Caleb added, You carrying his? Clara nodded. You've been treated right. She looked toward the house, better than I expected. Caleb followed her gaze, something unreadable flickering behind his eyes. That woman's colder than mountain stone, but she's got edges that aren't sharp, just buried. Clara tilted her head. You speak like you've been cut before. I speak like I don't care much for silk-draped grief, Caleb said plainly. But I respect the kind that doesn't ask for sympathy. Clara studied him. Why did you come here, really? Caleb hesitated, then said, Because I didn't want to be the only one carrying him. That afternoon, it rained. Slow, steady, soaking rain that turned the orchard paths to mud and softened the sharpness of the world. Josephine stood at the window of the library, staring out as droplets traced long lines down the glass. Behind her, Caleb cleared his throat. You read it. Yes. I figure there's more he didn't write. There always is, Josephine said. Caleb approached, not cautiously but with the calm of someone who had little to lose. He talked about you more than you think, said you were impossible, said you built a life for him out of ambition and hope. just didn't know when to let go. Josephine didn't flinch, but the tension in her shoulders deepened. You think I need forgiving? I think maybe he did too. She turned then, met his eyes. I didn't invite you here to dissect my parenting, Mr. Work. No, Caleb said. You invited me here to figure out what kind of man your son really was, and I'm telling you, he was better than either of us knew. That night, as Clara read by candlelight, a sharp pain took her mid-sentence. Not a twinge, a wrench. She gasped, clutching her side, the book sliding from her lap. She waited, breath held, hoping it would pass, but it came again, stronger. She stood, tried to call for help, but the second cry died in her throat. Her knees buckled. She collapsed beside the bed, one hand gripping the quilt, the other clutching her belly. Down the hall, Caleb heard something. A thump, a moan, barely a whisper, but he moved fast. Josephine heard the same and emerged from her study. They reached Clara's door at the same time. The scene inside was chaos. Clara curled on the floor, face pale, sweat dotting her brow. She looked up at them with wide, terrified eyes. It's too soon, she whispered. Something's wrong, something's wrong. Josephine didn't hesitate. Get the doctor. Caleb nodded and vanished down the stairs. Josephine knelt beside Clara, lifting her gently. Breathe, she said, voice low but firm. Look at me, breathe with me. I can't. Yes, you can, Josephine said. Her hands, once manicured and steady, now trembled as she brushed damp hair from Clara's brow. You're not alone. Clara gripped her wrist like a lifeline. Minutes passed like hours. Caleb returned, soaked from rain, a doctor trailing behind. The man, Dr. Hemley, set his case down and got to work. Josephine stayed at Clara's side the whole time. It's stress, Hemley said after a while. Nothing ruptured, no bleeding. The child still. Could go either way, but she's stable for now. She needs rest, Josephine asked. She needs more than that, less fear, less tension. This child's holding every tremor she feels. Clara turned her face away, ashamed. Josephine's voice was quiet. Then we changed that. When the sun rose, Clara slept. Her breathing had steadied. Josephine sat nearby, watching her, watching the soft rise and fall of the young woman's chest, the slight kick beneath the sheets. And for the first time since Elias died, she whispered aloud, not to a ghost but to something real. I'm still here. Outside, the orchard dripped with rain. Clara didn't remember falling asleep, only waking to a faint warmth in her hands and the vague scent of lavender hanging in the air. Light spilled softly across the room, filtered through thin curtains and catching on the basin of water by her bedside. Her fingers were curled around something, Josephine's. The older woman sat slouched in the nearby chair, chin tucked to her chest, fast asleep. Clara blinked. For a moment she didn't move, just stared at the faint rise and fall of Josephine's shoulders, the way one strand of silver hair had fallen out of its perfect bun. In sleep, she looked older, not weaker, just unguarded, like someone who'd held her breath too long and had finally let it out. Clara turned her gaze to the window. Her body still ached. Her child had not stirred yet, and that worried her more than anything else. But even as anxiety coiled in her belly, something else settled in behind it. Not peace, not yet, but closeness, an unspoken tether. She must have stirred louder than she thought, because Josephine's eyes opened suddenly, sharp and alert in an instant. She straightened in the chair, adjusting her cuffs with practiced elegance, but her voice was soft. You're awake. Clara nodded. I didn't mean to. You've nothing to apologize for. Josephine's eyes dropped briefly to their still-joined hands, and she let go as if only now realizing. You had us worried. Clara smiled faintly. I seem to be good at that lately. Josephine stood and poured a glass of water, handing it to her without a word. Clara drank gratefully, the coldness biting down her throat. Doctor says you need rest, Josephine said. No excitement, no stress. You'll remain in bed for the next week. Clara's brow furrowed. I can still walk, I'm not helpless. You're not, Josephine agreed. But the child might be, and that changes everything. Clara blinked, thrown by the intensity of her tone. You really mean to help me? I mean to protect my grandchild, Josephine said, her words clipped. Then quieter, and you, if you'll let me. It was the closest thing to affection she'd ever shown. Clara lay back against the pillows, emotion clogging her throat. She turned her face toward the window, not to hide her tears but to give them space to fall. Downstairs, Caleb Rourke leaned against the kitchen doorway, coffee in hand, eyes narrowed on the rain outside. He hadn't slept either. Something about this house, it scratched at him like wool on bare skin. Too fine, too quiet, too filled with memories that didn't belong to him. The cook offered him a second cup, and he accepted it with a grunt of thanks. She didn't ask where he'd been or what kind of man he was. That suited him fine. By mid-morning the rain had stopped. Josephine found him in the orchard, hat low, boots deep in wet soil. She'll be all right, he asked without turning. For now. He nodded once, good. Josephine folded her arms. Why are you still here? Caleb tilted his head. You tell me. She didn't answer. The wind stirred the trees. He finally turned to face her. You afraid I'll say something you don't want to hear? I'm afraid you already did. Caleb smirked. He loved her, you know, Elia's. I could see it all over him. That kind of love, it doesn't show up neat. It wrecks things, rearranges people. Josephine didn't speak, but her lips pressed into a thinner line. I think it scared him, Caleb went on. Not because he didn't want it, but because he knew it would make him stay. Josephine's voice was a whisper, and he'd already promised to leave. Promised you. The words hit like a slap. She didn't deny it. I raised him to be his father, she said finally. Strong, strategic, relentless. Caleb's gaze softened. He became a man, not a general. He was both, Josephine said, but there was no pride in it, only loss. The next few days passed in a slow, careful rhythm. Clara remained upstairs, mostly asleep, though she woke often enough to eat, to talk, to feel the faintest flutter of life return inside her. Each night, Josephine read to her not fiction but pages from Elia's journal, his thoughts, his quiet moments. Clara listened like they were lullabies. One evening, as Josephine closed the worn cover, Clara said, "He was softer than people think." Josephine nodded. He didn't inherit that from me. Clara looked at her. He never stopped loving you, even when he left. Josephine's hands trembled. He never told me. He didn't know how, Clara said. But I saw it. I felt it. He kept your letters, even the ones he never answered. Josephine didn't respond, but that night she returned to her room and dug through the box she hadn't opened since the funeral. Inside were all the letters she'd sent. All but one were still sealed, but the last had been opened, folded, worn at the edges. She pressed it to her lips and closed her eyes. One morning, Clara screamed. Josephine reached her room in seconds, heart pounding, only to find Clara hunched over, one hand gripping the dresser, the other stretched protectively over her belly. Something's wrong, Clara gasped. I can't feel he's not moving. Josephine caught her. Lie down now. Caleb arrived moments later, summoned by the maid's frantic yell. He took one look at Clara's pale face and ran for the doctor. Dr. Hemley came within the hour. He pressed his ear to her belly, fingers moving with practiced speed. Then he looked up, face grim. Heartbeats faint, he said. Could be cord compression, could be trauma, could be nothing, but we'll know soon. Clara's eyes brimmed. Is he? He's alive, but it's not time yet. If we force it now, you risk both of you. Josephine stood at the window, fists clenched. What can we do? Keep her calm, keep her safe, pray. Later that night, Josephine found herself in Elia's room again. She hadn't stepped inside since the journal. Now she walked slowly, carefully. She sat on his bed, then knelt beside it. And for the first time since he died, she prayed. Not to a God she trusted, but to a son she'd never fully known. "Please," she whispered, "let me do this right, let me keep her safe." The following morning, something shifted. The storm clouds cleared, the air lightened. And Clara felt a kick. Then another. Then a slow, steady rhythm. She cried, gasping, hand clutched to her stomach. Josephine rushed to her side. When she saw the look on Clara's face, she dropped to her knees. "He's okay," Clara sobbed. "He's okay." Josephine pressed her forehead to Clara's belly. "Thank you," she whispered, to no one and everyone at once. Later that afternoon, the front gates creaked open. A stranger arrived, an older woman in traveling clothes, a small case in her hand. She looked weathered but calm, eyes clear, voice soft. She introduced herself to the maid. "My name is Helen Rourke. I'm looking for my son." The maid blinked. "You mean Mr. Caleb?" "Yes, he wrote to me. Said he was staying with the Vale family. Said he was found." Josephine greeted her in the front hall, stunned. Helen Rourke was not what she expected. She was gentle, deliberate, and asked no questions that weren't necessary. "I thought he was dead," Helen said quietly, sipping tea. "Then I got his letter, after 4 years." Josephine stared at the woman. Then slowly she smiled. "He's not the only one being found lately." That night Josephine tucked Clara in. "You're not alone anymore," she said. "Neither of us are." Clara touched her hand gently. "Thank you." But Josephine shook her head. "No, thank you, for saving what I still had left to give." The orchard was in full bloom by the end of the week, petals opening like fragile promises, white and pink against the greening branches. The breeze had changed, too. It no longer carried only silence and sorrow, but something lighter, though still uncertain. Caleb stood beneath the largest tree, a piece of straw between his teeth, watching the wind dance through the blossoms. Clara had walked that same orchard path earlier that morning, hand resting against her belly, a faint smile haunting her lips. The child stirred more now, strong and consistent, like he was ready to meet the world that had nearly broken his mother. From the parlor window, Josephine watched her, eyes narrowed not in judgment but in calculation, the kind that comes from someone trying to make sense of unfamiliar peace. She wasn't used to a house with laughter. She wasn't used to someone else humming softly upstairs while brushing their hair, or to meals eaten in the company of more than silver and silence. She built her life around routine and resolve, but the past weeks had shattered the architecture of her loneliness. Helen Rourke had taken a guest room near the rear of the house. She moved gently through the halls, with quiet eyes and gentle questions, and made herself useful in ways that didn't call attention to themselves. She mended a torn curtain without being asked. She made Clara a cup of ginger tea before anyone else thought to. Josephine hadn't expected to like her, but she did. In fact, she found herself looking for Helen's calm presence without even realizing it. At breakfast, Caleb mentioned he was leaving. Josephine didn't look up from her coffee. "Where to?" "Back south," he said. "Work at the rail yard. My mother will be fine on her own, but I can't stay here, Mrs. Vale, much as your orchard's grown on me." "You think you owe nothing more?" she asked coolly. Caleb shrugged. "I stayed longer than I meant to, gave what I had to give." Clara set down her spoon gently. "You were there when Elias died. You think he'd want you to walk away from what he left behind?" Caleb met her eyes. "He left you, not me." "He left you both," Josephine said, voice quieter now. "He trusted you with his last days, and he trusted her with his future. Neither one of you gets to run." Caleb pushed back his chair, the scrape loud in the silence. "I wasn't made for this house," he muttered. "I'm not a nursemaid, I'm not a son. I did my part." Helen spoke then, calm and precise. "You think your part's over, but maybe it's just the only one you're comfortable with." That made him stop. He glanced at her, eyes hard, but she didn't flinch. "I raised you," Helen said. I watched you vanish into the war and come back colder. And I never said it out loud, Caleb, but I missed the boy who used to build traps in the garden and ask me what stars were made of. I thought I'd lost him. Maybe I had. But when you wrote to me, I knew something had changed. Caleb looked at the floor. You came here to finish something, Helen added. But maybe it's something you don't need to finish. Maybe it's something you need to begin. He left without another word. The door shut softly behind him. Clara's hand moved to her belly. Josephine exhaled. Let him go, she said. He'll come back if he's meant to. That afternoon, Josephine found herself in Elia's room again. She sat at his desk, running her fingers across the grooves left by his writing, by years of pressure and purpose. The house creaked around her like it always had, but now the creaks didn't feel like ghosts, they felt like breathing. She opened the drawer on the left and found the letter she'd hidden from herself. It was addressed to her, in Elia's handwriting, sealed but never sent. The postmark was dated only 3 days before his death. Her fingers trembled as she broke the seal. Ma, I don't know what you'll feel when you read this. Maybe anger, maybe nothing, but I can't leave things undone. I wanted you to know I'm happy. That's not something I've said much, and maybe not something you've ever needed to hear. Clara is carrying our child. I didn't plan for it, but it doesn't feel like an accident either. It feels like forgiveness, like a future I never knew how to ask for. I know I've failed you in ways. I wasn't the son you dreamed of, but I think I'm becoming the man I was meant to be. I just hope, when the time comes, you can meet them without looking for all the wrong in it. I'm not coming back to resume my place beside you. I'm coming back to start something else. With love, Elias. Josephine sat for a long time with the letter folded in her lap, tears finally spilling. Not loud sobs, just slow, steady, the kind you don't stop because you've carried them too long. Caleb didn't return that evening, or the next. By the third morning, Clara woke with a pain in her side that didn't go away. Not sharp, not unbearable, but consistent, like something under the surface had shifted. She kept quiet most of the day, unsure whether it was worry or instinct that made her afraid. That night, Josephine found her pacing. You're in pain, she said. Clara nodded slowly. It's coming, isn't it? Josephine placed a hand on her belly, then looked her in the eye. Yes. The labor began just past midnight, quiet at first. Clara sat upright in bed, breath steady, trying not to panic. Helen and Josephine took turns cooling her forehead, holding her hand. Dr. Hemley arrived quickly, but even he could sense something in the air. This wasn't just a birth. This was a reckoning. Hours passed. The sun began to rise. Clara screamed, sweat pouring down her neck, hair stuck to her cheeks. It's close, Hemley said, but he's turned wrong. We might need to. Just get him out, Clara sobbed. Please, please, I just need to see him. Josephine held her shoulders. You will, I swear it. I'm so scared. I am too. Another push, another cry, another hour passed. And then, a cry. High, wet, alive. The child was lifted into the air, squirming, mouth open in indignation. Josephine pressed her fingers to her lips. Helen whispered thanks under her breath. Clara collapsed back, sobbing with relief. He's okay, she gasped. The doctor smiled. He's very okay. The baby was placed in her arms, red and furious, flailing tiny fists. She looked at him for the first time and said, Elias. Josephine turned away, swallowing something that hurt too much to speak. That afternoon, as light slanted through the nursery windows, a figure appeared at the gate. Caleb. His coat was soaked, hat gone, face rough from the road. He stood still for a long moment before walking up the path. Josephine opened the door herself. Thought you were gone, she said. Had to think, he replied. And he looked up at her, I want to meet my godson." She stared, then stepped aside. Upstairs, Clara held the child, humming softly. She looked up when Caleb entered. He froze. "He looks like Elias," Caleb said quietly. Clara smiled. "He'll need someone to teach him how to swing a hammer." Caleb chuckled. "I can do that." He stepped closer, reaching out. The baby grabbed his finger and didn't let go. The house had never known this kind of quiet. Not the sharp-edged silence of grief or the solemn hush of waiting, but something softer, something earned. In the days following Elias' birth, the world inside Josephine Vale's estate moved slower, more gently, like everyone understood they'd stepped into something fragile and sacred. The child slept often, curled against Clara's chest or swaddled in the cradle Caleb carved in the corner of the nursery. Every breath he took seemed to tether them all, Josephine, Caleb, Helen, and Clara, to something bigger than what they'd come through. Josephine didn't hold the boy right away. She stayed near, observant, always watching from the edges of the room with a quiet kind of reverence that had nothing to do with distance and everything to do with fear. Fear that she'd hold him and see Elias. Fear that she wouldn't. But on the fourth night, after a storm swept through and left the windows fogged and the hearth glowing low, Clara reached out and gently placed the child into her arms without asking. Josephine froze at first. She didn't move, didn't blink, just stared at the bundle of blankets and soft fists. The boy's eyes were half-lidded, fluttering with the tail end of sleep. He let out a gurgle, more breath than sound. Her heart seized. "I don't know how to be this," Josephine whispered, her voice nearly lost in the flicker of firelight. "You don't have to know," Clara replied softly. "Just be near." Josephine held him tighter, awkwardly at first, then with a steadiness that surprised her. She felt his warmth sink into her arms, his tiny breaths against her collarbone, and something inside her shifted, not a crack, not a break. A thaw. The kind that happens in spring, slow and almost invisible but unstoppable. Clara watched them, her eyes shining, and said nothing else. Caleb had returned to the barn after dark. He didn't sleep much anymore, never had, really, but the quiet there suited him better than the grand rooms upstairs. He sat by the open loft window, the night air cool against his face. Below, the horses stirred, shifting their weight, snorting occasionally, but otherwise still. He thought of Elias often now, not with the bitterness that used to haunt him, but with something closer to longing. They'd both been soldiers, but Elias had carried something Caleb never could, hope. Even when the sky turned black and men turned on each other, Elias had always looked beyond the smoke, convinced there was more. Caleb had envied that, had feared it too. Helen joined him in the loft sometime after midnight. She didn't say a word as she climbed the ladder, just settled beside him, her hands in her lap. "I thought you were sleeping," Caleb said. "I did," she replied, "and then I woke. That happens when you're my age." He glanced at her sidelong. "You think I did the right thing staying?" Helen took her time answering. "I think the right thing isn't always the easiest, or the cleanest, but it's the one that sits quiet in your chest instead of rattling around like a bad penny." Caleb sighed. "It still feels like I'm standing in someone else's story." "No," Helen said. "You just stepped into the part of yours where you stop running." He nodded, then turned back to the night. "I think Elias would have been a good father." "He already was," Helen said, "the moment he chose to come back." Morning brought unexpected news. A letter, delivered by a writer from town, bearing the stamp of the county courthouse. Josephine opened it at the breakfast table, flanked by Clara on one side and Caleb on the other. Her hand stilled halfway down the page. "What is it?" Clara asked, instinctively pulling Elias close to her chest. Josephine's mouth thinned. "It's from the solicitor, my late husband's younger brother, Charles. He's contesting the inheritance." Caleb's jaw set. "On what grounds?" Josephine didn't look up. "Claims I've let the estate fall into unfit hands. That Elias' death voids any succession, and that the land would be better managed under his name. "But he's never stepped foot here," Clara said, incredulous. "Doesn't matter," Josephine said. "He's wealthy, connected, the kind of man who wins things because he assumes they were his all along." Caleb stood, pushing his chair back. "Then we fight it." "With what?" she snapped. "You think the courts care about letters and grief and what's right. They care about names, signatures, and Elias is gone." Clara's voice was soft but steady. "Not all of him." They both looked at her. "The child is his," she said, "and that means something." Josephine's expression darkened. "Only if I legitimize the union. Only if I say you were more than a companion, that you were his wife, or promised to be." Clara swallowed. "You don't believe I was." "I want to," Josephine said, and the words sounded like they hurt. "God help me, I want to, but wanting doesn't stand in court." Caleb crossed his arms. "Then lie, for once in your life, bend the truth." "I've spent my whole life surviving on truth," Josephine hissed. "You think I don't know how dangerous lies become?" Clara rose, trembling. "Then let me swear it, under oath. I'll say it. I'll sign it. You don't even have to believe it as long as the court does." Silence fell. Even baby Elias went still, as if sensing the tension humming through the room. Finally, Josephine exhaled. "We'll need a notary, and a lawyer willing to look the other way." "I know someone," Caleb said. "Of course you do," Josephine muttered. By the following week, the paperwork had begun. Declarations, sworn affidavits, old letters rewritten to read like love notes. It felt ugly, manipulative, desperate. But the land was more than just acres and trees. It was Elias' legacy. It was the one thing Josephine could still protect. And then, as if summoned by the stirrings of inheritance, Charles Vale arrived. He came with 2 riders and a clerk, dressed in velvet and silk, boots polished to a shine, eyes like mirrors that reflected nothing but his own importance. He didn't knock. He announced himself with a declaration of intent and a demand for tea. Josephine met him on the porch, chin high, hands folded. "I see you've redecorated," Charles said, glancing around with mild disdain. "Always did have a taste for the theatrical." "Still do," Josephine replied, "hence your entrance." Charles smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Let's not pretend this is a battle, sister. I'm simply correcting a mistake." "The only mistake was you being born second," she said. His eyes flashed. "This land was meant for strong hands. It withers under sentiment." "It was meant for Elias," she snapped. "And Elias is gone." "Not entirely." He tilted his head. "So I've heard. Some peasant girl swearing up and down she carried his child. How convenient." Josephine's hands clenched. "Say that again in front of her." "I'd rather not risk the theatrics of a woman's tears," he said, stepping past her. "Now where's your notary?" Clara watched from the upstairs window, holding her son tighter. The hearing was set for the following month. Until then, everything hung in balance. The land, the house, the boy. Clara began preparing for the worst, collecting her few things, making a list of safe places in other towns, of people she might beg for help if it all fell apart. Caleb caught her packing one night and closed the door behind him. "Don't," he said simply. She looked up, startled. "I'm being practical." "You're being scared." "Shouldn't I be?" "No," he said, "not here, not now." She sat on the edge of the bed, her back to him. "I never expected to end up in a place like this, with people like her, or you. I don't know where I belong anymore." "You belong where he left you," Caleb said, stepping closer. "And he left you here." Tears slipped down her cheeks. "I'm not strong like you." He knelt beside her, gently touching her hand. "You've carried a child through grief and storms and fear. You think strength looks like silence and fists, but it doesn't. It looks like you." Clara leaned into him, trembling. "You stay," he whispered. "You fight." The night before the hearing, Josephine lit every lamp in the parlor. She placed Elia's portrait on the mantel. She read his last letter again. She sat with Clara, combing through statements, organizing affidavits. Helen brewed tea no one drank. Caleb stood guard by the window, watching the path for movement. No one slept. Dawn came slow and bruised, and with it, the fate of the land Elias once called home. The courthouse sat squat and pale against the sky, its paint weathered to gray and the windows glinting like half-lidded eyes. People gathered there early, not in droves, but in that quiet, curious way townsfolk do when they hear something about to change hands. Land meant money. Names meant status. A veil on the stand meant drama. Josephine Vale arrived just after sunrise in a dark dress without lace or frill, her hair pinned tight and her gloves spotless. She walked with Clara beside her, Clara in a borrowed coat and the boy nestled against her chest, his eyes wide and blinking in the unfamiliar light. Caleb followed just behind, and Helen came too, quieter but firm, the hem of her shawl whispering along the floorboards as they crossed the entry. Charles was already inside. He stood at the head of the courtroom, one hand on the back of a chair like he owned it, speaking with the clerk in a low, assured tone. His smile widened as he turned to see them enter, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Josephine," he said with false warmth, "you brought the whole congregation." "I brought the truth," she answered. Clara didn't flinch, though every muscle in her back tensed as they approached the benches. The judge was a narrow man named Finch, white-haired, clean-shaven, and known in 3 counties for being both humorless and loyal to whatever paper bore the seal of law. He wasn't cruel, just cold, and that made him dangerous. He struck the gavel once. "Petition to transfer ownership of the Vale estate from the widow Josephine Vale to her brother-in-law Charles Vale," he said, voice clipped. "Challenge filed by Josephine Vale, on grounds of prior succession through her son Elias Vale. This court is here to determine the legitimacy of that succession. State your case." Charles stood first. He spoke clean and proud, years of business talk bleeding into every syllable. He laid out his claim like a map, orderly and wide. He brought deeds, tax records, letters of Elias' absence. He painted a picture of a family crumbling under grief and sentiment, land unmanaged, fortune bleeding away beneath well-intended but inadequate hands. He didn't sneer when he said it. He smiled. That made it worse. Josephine rose next. She read from the letter Elias had written. She spoke clearly without wavering and produced documents signed by her son acknowledging both Clara and the unborn child. She laid the facts out one by one. Elias' return, his death, the witness of Caleb Rourke, the arrival of Clara and the boy now born of that union. Finch's eyes shifted to Clara. "You say you bore this child from Elias Vale?" "Yes, sir," Clara said softly. "You were not married?" "No." "Were you engaged?" Clara hesitated, not formally. "And yet you claim this child is heir to the Vale estate." "I claim he's Elias' son," Clara said, "and that Elias meant for him to have a life here. I didn't come asking for money. I came to visit his grave. That's all I wanted. It's everything I ever wanted." Finch folded his hands. "We will need more than intention. The law is not swayed by sentiment." That was when Caleb stood. "I was there when Elias died," he said. "He made me promise I'd find Clara, that I'd bring her north if I could. He didn't say marry her. He didn't say prove anything. He said protect her. That was all, and I did." Finch raised an eyebrow. "You're not family." "No," Caleb said, "but I'm telling you the truth. And if the law ain't built to hold the truth, then maybe the law's what needs changing." Finch said nothing. The room held its breath. Josephine stepped forward once more. "If this court rules in favor of Charles," she said, "you hand over not just a house but everything my son built, every piece of him that still walks this earth." Finch tapped the gavel again. "Enough. The court will recess for deliberation." Outside, the wind had picked up. Clara stepped into the shade of the veranda, heart pounding, the child heavy in her arms. She didn't look at Charles as he passed her, but she felt the weight of his gaze all the same. "You won't win," he said under his breath. "You're nothing but a ghost clinging to a name that was never yours." Clara didn't respond. She only held the baby tighter. Josephine watched it all unfold. Her hands didn't shake, but her throat felt like gravel. Helen stood beside her and laid a hand on her arm. "You gave them everything," she whispered, "and so did he." "They'll take it anyway," Josephine murmured, "because they can." "Maybe," Helen said, "or maybe you've got more than land on your side." The court reconvened an hour later. Finch cleared his throat. "This court finds that while no legal marriage existed between Elias Vale and Clara Hammond, evidence provided, including letters, witness testimony, and the child's confirmed paternity, suggests Elias Vale intended to pass his estate to the issue of his bloodline. As such, I rule in favor of the challenge. The estate will remain under the care of Josephine Vale until such a time as the child Elias Rourke Vale comes of age." The room exhaled. Josephine blinked once, then again, as if the words had come too fast. Clara gasped softly, her hand flying to her mouth. Charles stood, his chair scraping the floor, face flushed with disbelief. "This is an outrage," he said. "A bastard child and some backwoods testimony. You unseat me for sentiment." "No," Finch said coolly, "for truth." The gavel struck. And just like that, it was done. They rode home in silence, the sun warm on their faces, the road stretching long and golden before them. No one spoke until the house came into view, the orchard shimmering in the distance like something born new. Josephine stepped down first. She didn't rush, she didn't speak. She walked to the porch, hand resting on the rail. Then slowly she turned back to Clara. "You'll need a proper room," she said. Clara nodded, stunned. "And a proper name for the boy on the deed." Clara swallowed. Elias Rourke Vale. Josephine's throat tightened. He'd have liked that. Caleb helped Helen down from the wagon, then lingered beside Clara. "You gonna stay now?" he asked. She looked up at the house, the light spilling from the windows, the sound of wind through the branches. "I think," she said slowly, "I already did." That night they sat together for supper, Josephine, Clara, Caleb, Helen, and the baby sleeping in his cradle by the fire. The table felt full in a way it hadn't in years, full of voices, laughter. Even silence now was welcome. It wasn't a house of ghosts anymore. It was a house of echoes, ones that belonged to the living. Clara stood at the window after the meal, staring out at the orchard. The moonlight spilled across the grass, soft and silver. Caleb joined her. "You think he'd be proud?" She smiled. "He'd be mad it took me this long to stop running." "He'd say you did just fine." Josephine watched them from her chair, a faint smile playing at the corner of her lips. Helen sat beside her, knitting something soft and gray. The night settled around them like a promise. For the first time in a long time, the future didn't look like a shadow. It looked like spring. But just before dawn, something stirred. A rider, alone, moving slow along the southern ridge, his silhouette sharp against the pale sky. He didn't carry a banner. He didn't wear a badge, but he brought with him the kind of stillness that made birds go silent. Caleb saw him first. He stepped out into the yard, hand resting instinctively on the axe near the barn. He didn't call out, didn't move. The rider saw him, reined in, then spoke. "Looking for Josephine Vale." Caleb said nothing. The rider dismounted, pulled a folded document from his coat. "Court notice, from Missouri, claims filed under Clara Hammond's name." Caleb's eyes narrowed. "What claims?" The man didn't flinch. "Unpaid debts, theft, fugitive status, warrants. Says she ran from a warrant 2 years back, disappeared with stolen money. Former employer's signature confirms the charge. He held the paper out. Caleb didn't take it. He just stared at the stranger and said quietly, "You'd best come inside." The knock came just as the sky turned amber with the edge of dawn. Josephine Vale was already awake, seated in her chair by the window with a blanket over her knees and a pot of cooling tea at her side. She hadn't slept, not really. She sat with the letter Elias once wrote folded in her lap, reading it over and over until the words no longer meant only grief. They meant a map, a lifeline, a promise half kept. The knock came again, a firm, even rhythm. She rose. By the time she opened the door, Caleb was already there, standing just behind the stranger with a look that said the man hadn't yet earned welcome, only the right to speak. The rider turned slowly. "Josephine Vale." "I am," she said. Her voice held no tremble. He handed her the paper, creased but clean. "You'll want to read that." Josephine took it with steady fingers. Her eyes flicked over the ink quickly, her face unreadable. Behind her, inside the house, Clara stirred, Elias waking in her arms, his tiny cries muffled against her shoulder. She hadn't heard the exchange yet. Not yet. Josephine didn't blink. "This claim is from Missouri." "Yes, ma'am." "It's dated 2 years ago." "Yes." "It alleges Clara Hammond fled the state with stolen funds. Claims she was a domestic servant for a banker's family. Accuses her of fraud and theft." "All true," the man replied. "Far as the papers say." Caleb stepped forward. "And who are you to come here claiming it?" The man hesitated. "I ain't law, not exactly. I'm hired. They sent me to find her." Josephine's voice turned to iron. "Bounty." "No," the man said. "Reward." "There's a difference." "Only if you're the one being hunted." Caleb's fists clenched. Josephine turned without a word and walked back into the house. Clara was in the kitchen, swaying gently to soothe the child. She looked up when Josephine entered. "You're up early," Clara said. Josephine didn't answer at first. She crossed the floor slowly, unfolded the paper, and laid it flat on the table. Clara looked down and went still. "No," she whispered. Josephine said nothing. Clara's eyes scanned the letter again, her breath hitching with each word. She looked up slowly, tears already surfacing. "I didn't steal it," she said, voice trembling. "It wasn't like that." Josephine's face stayed unreadable. "Then tell me what it was like." Clara swallowed hard. "I was working for the Ashleys in St. Louis. They weren't cruel, just careless, left money out, never paid me on time. Their son Thomas, he started noticing me, following me, saying things." Josephine's gaze narrowed. "What kinds of things?" Clara looked away. "Things I didn't want, things that meant trouble if I said no." The room went silent. "One night he came into the kitchen drunk," Clara continued. "Said I owed him for the roof over my head. Said no one would believe me if I screamed, so I ran. I didn't even take the money, not then. But the next morning they said their lockbox was gone, claimed I'd taken it." "Did you?" Josephine asked. Clara didn't answer right away, her jaw clenched. "I took what I was owed, wages for 6 months of labor, that's all, nothing more." Caleb entered then, his presence quiet but solid. He looked at Clara. "You never told Elias." Clara shook her head. "I thought I could outrun it. I thought if I started over, it'd stay behind me." Josephine's fingers curled around the edge of the table. "They'll come back. The man outside may be just a messenger, but the Ashleys won't stop with letters, especially if there's money involved." Clara looked down at her son. "Then I'll leave." "No," Josephine said flatly. "You won't." Clara's head snapped up. "What?" "You're not going anywhere," Josephine said. "Not after everything we've built. I can't drag your name through the mud." Josephine stepped forward. "Do you think I care about reputation? I've buried a husband and a son. I've fought for every inch of this land. and I finally found something worth fighting for again. I'm not letting you or that child vanish into the wind because some coward with a rich family can't stand the sound of the word no. But the law. Let them come, Josephine said. We'll answer them. Clara was shaking now, not from fear but from something deeper, something like awe. Why? She asked. Why would you stand by me after this? Josephine's voice softened. Because Elias would have, because he already did, and because I know what it's like to be called a liar when all you've done is survive. The rider stayed the night. Josephine offered him the guest room with a glass of bourbon and a promise not to poison it. He didn't argue. By morning he was gone, left with no signature, no capture, no story to sell. Just a letter, rewritten in Josephine's hand, attesting to Clara's wages, her character, and her place in the Vale household as mother of the rightful heir. She sealed it with the family crest and told him, if they want a fight, tell them to bring a better one. He left without a word. Weeks passed. The orchard bloomed again. The boy grew fast, his fingers curling around Caleb's beard, his eyes always drawn to the light. Helen taught Clara how to preserve peaches in jars and thread a quilt tight enough to outlast a season. Caleb built a cradle from oak. Josephine wrote letters, one every week, to every contact she had west of the Mississippi, drawing lines between allies and enemies like a general preparing for war. And still the storm never came. No riders, no warrants, no Ashleys. Just quiet and life. Until one morning, when a horse arrived with no rider. Clara found it grazing near the fence, saddled, lathered, bleeding from the flank. She called out for Caleb, who came running. He approached the animal slowly, hands open. The horse didn't spook. It was tired, half dead. Caleb removed a folded slip of paper tied under the saddle horn. It was wet, smudged, barely legible. But one word stood out. Run! He turned to Clara, his voice low and urgent. Go inside now. The house turned frantic within seconds. Josephine locked windows. Caleb loaded the rifle. Helen took the baby and Clara to the cellar, where she laid out blankets over the cold stone floor. Outside, the air held something strange. No birdsong, no breeze, just stillness. And then hoofbeats. 3 riders this time. Not bounty men, not marshals. Mercenaries. They didn't carry warrants, they carried rifles. Caleb stood on the porch as they approached. He didn't raise his weapon, not yet. The lead man dismounted, tall, thin, smile like frostbite. We're looking for a girl, he said. You won't find her here, Caleb replied. The man tilted his head. That's so. Josephine stepped outside, shotgun in her arms. She's not yours to take. We were hired, ma'am, he said. Not to ask, just to return property. She's not property. Well, the man said, glancing toward the house. That's something the Ashleys don't quite agree on. Josephine's finger tensed on the trigger. You take one step closer to my door, and I'll make sure you never take another. The man laughed. You think a fancy widow and a farmhand scare me. You're not scared now, Caleb said, but give it a minute. A pause. Then the man raised his hand. And the others reached for their guns. But the first shot didn't come from the house. It came from the hill. A single crack split the air, and one of the riders screamed, his gun flying from his hand as he fell from the saddle. The others froze. And from the orchard 6 men appeared, farmers, ranchers, neighbors, each one armed. Josephine smiled coldly. Turns out, Elias left more than just land behind, he left people. The mercenaries backed off. One helped his wounded partner up. The lead man raised his hands. No trouble, he said. Too late for that, Caleb answered. But he let them leave. That night they sat around the fire again. Clara held Elias close, rocking him softly. Josephine stared into the flames. They'll come again, Caleb said quietly. Different names, different means. I know, Josephine said. So what do we do? She looked at Clara, then at the boy. We hold, she said. We fight. We teach him to be brave. Caleb nodded, and if that ain't enough. Josephine's eyes burned steady. Then we remind them some roots don't tear easy. Outside, the wind blew through the orchard. But the trees didn't bend. Not this time. Not ever again.